Okay. Thanks for being here tonight. It's exciting to come back to Monhegan. I'm always amazed how many apples there are here, but I'm amazed at how many apples there are everywhere. We are in some ways the Kazakhstan of the United States. Kazakhstan is, as I'll explain in a minute, is the home of one of the species of apples that creates the apple that we eat. I'm going to explain a little bit about that because it's kind of wacky fact about apples, that they're not naturally occurring fruit. So let's go. A little background, I'm Todd Little-Siebold, and I'm apple obsessed, particularly with historic apples. I'm trained as a Latin American historian, and I teach at the College of the Atlantic. If you had told me even 20 years ago that somehow I would be spending almost every fall, most of the winter, and lots of the spring, parts of the summer, looking at old apple trees, trying to track them down, researching them, and trying to figure out the sort of puzzles behind them, I would have said you're crazy. So this came along as a sort of a surprise at the College of the Atlantic. I'm the history department, so I have to teach a little bit of all kinds of history. And I started with a class called the History of Agriculture, Apples. It was basically about teaching kids, my students, about what was going on in the landscape around Bar Harbor, Mount Desert Island, Hancock County over time, and how you could see that in the landscape through the trees, through lilacs, through other sorts of things. And they became very interested in it, and I became more interested in it, and then they became more interested, and I became more interested in it. And now, basically, I've made it my life's work to contribute to the rescuing, restoring, and propagating of old, historic American apples. They're all over the landscape. You have many of them here, and they're the last remnants of an agricultural landscape and lifestyle that has been in decline now for almost 100 years, 120 years in some cases, and where you have maybe a decade or two to save those last trees before they're gone. And as I said, my day job as a professor of history at the College of the Atlantic is the best day job I could possibly ask for because I get to do whatever I want. Nobody's telling me, oh, you can't teach that, you can't teach that. I get to teach history in a way that resonates with students about things that they're interested in. I do marine environmental history, I do history of fisheries along the coast, Native American history of the Wabanaki people, a lot of other things. So it's a really great place. And this is a tree that's 11.5 feet in circumference. So, you know, it takes those two students to hug it.
How old is that tree?
Maybe 200 years old. So one of the things that I want, and this is another one, 11.5 feet in circumference over in Bass Harbor, Southwest Harbor on MDI. Again, another one that's about 11 feet in circumference. Again, in that sort of 200-year-old. So what I want to find, what I'm looking for constantly is really old trees that can connect us to that really deep historical past, but also the DNA of really old trees, even trees that no longer exist, that connect us to that really deep past. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And basically, I'm here today because, you know, to report back, but also to explain, you know, how to keep your eyes open for old trees. And then you could call Jen, and Jen can call me and say, look, there's this really big tree, very interesting tree, you should come see it. Okay. And I've just recently launched a new project called the Maine Apple Lab at the College of the Atlantic. It's basically focused on speeding up the process of identifying and researching the historic cultivars that we're looking for because we don't have time. Using DNA analysis and traditional historical research methods to identify the places that are most likely to have these lost varieties. I'm working with an international group of collaborators. In fact, I'm going to the UK in a couple weeks in November to coordinate with British researchers so that their DNA sampling and our DNA sampling aligns so that we can learn more together. And I've partnered for many years. I've worked with the Maine Heritage Orchard at MOFGA, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association in Unity, where we have a collection of 400 to 450 of these lost cultivars. There were probably between 800 and 900 in Maine. So every year we find more, we propagate them, we put them in the orchard, and that's basically a preservation orchard to save the rarest and most unique apples, most of which are basically from, were grown in or from Maine, and some we'll never know the name of, but we're propagating them to keep them going for the next generation. So the Monhegan journey so far, this project began in 2021, and I am looking for the earliest apple introductions in North America. Where was it that the first apples were introduced by Europeans? And I've been working on this now for 3 or 4 years, but I came to Monhegan because it's an offshore island, very likely used as a seasonal fishing station by very early fishermen. And when I say very early, 1510, 1520, as you'll see, you know, in my talk a little bit about a timeline, apples are reported in New England by 1524. Apples are introduced from Europe. So somebody introduced an apple along the coast of Maine or Massachusetts prior to 1524, so 500 years ago. So when I came in 21, I was helped by Kathy Krause and a friend Carrie Wilkins, who sort of showed me around. We began to look at apples, collect apples. We collected a few samples, came back in 2022 to talk a little bit more about the work that I was doing, and took some more samples. And the hypothesis is that some of the oldest DNA genetics in America is on these offshore islands because it was the places that were used by fishermen who were coming over from England, France, and Spain well before settlement. So this island has a brief English settlement around 1608, maybe, we think, 1612, but these fishermen would have been here 100 years before that, potentially. So looking all along the coast here, and then we're going to actually extend our research up into Nova Scotia, Newfoundland as well, to see if we can find some of that. So we collected samples in 21 and 22, and now started to get some results. Okay, but first, where do apples come from? So I'm going to start this. I start almost all my talks with this because this is one of the most important biological facts about apples to understand. So this is an apple from over on Path 5 that Kathy collected. And I'm going to call it Path 5 russet because it's russeted like a potato on the outside. It's kind of rough on the outside. So the Path 5 russet, if I take this seed from inside of it, and Jen plants that seed, and then I give one to my wife, Krista, who's back here, and she plants one. These are unique trees. We will not get Path 5 russet ever again from a seed. Okay, the seeds are now genetically unique, like we're genetically unique from our parents. Okay? So this is really fundamental fact. So if I want to get Path 5 russet, I've got to go take a piece off of it and graft it onto a rootstock or onto another tree, which is a form of cloning. Okay? So the seeds in here on this apple, every one is genetically unique, and every seed in every piece of fruit on this tree is genetically unique. Just like our children and grandchildren are not like our parents. So to get an apple, again, of the same variety that you want, you have to graft it. Okay? So this is a fundamental reality of propagation of these, particularly palm fruits, apples and a few other varieties. And it's fundamentally important because there are two things to understand about this. Every single apple ever that we eat was once a seed, like in here, that fell on the ground and it grew, and then somebody walked over to it and tried it, and they said, whoa, this is great, I'm going to propagate it. And they came back the next winter, they took off a piece of it, and then they went and put it on a tree at their house. Okay? So that's how varieties get propagated. So for example, how many of you have heard of Macintosh, the Apple Macintosh? Raise your hands. Okay. Every single Macintosh apple in the world has an origin in a single tree that grew from a seed in Ontario, Dundela, Ontario, and a guy who's clearing out a section of his pasture found this tree and said, this is really good. His name was Macintosh, and he named it after himself. So every single Macintosh tree in the world that exists is just a piece of wood off of a piece of wood off of a piece of wood off of a piece of wood that goes back to a tree that's found in 1797 by a guy named John Macintosh in Dundela, Ontario. Super, super interesting. And what's really important then, every variety, there's a story for a tree, a single tree, for every variety where somebody said, this is a really good apple, I'm going to propagate it. And today I'm going to tell you about a tree that's on Monhegan that I think that happened to. But first, where do they come from? So apples are not native, these apples are not native to North America. And they're a combination of three different species of apples that come together over about 4,000 to 8,000 years. We don't know how long it took. I'm going to explain this, but they start, we think, in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan. They move east, and then apples from Western Europe and the Middle East move west. They come together, and they create a new hybrid. So our Malus domestica, which is all the apples that we eat, is a product of thousands of years of human movement, and they basically mix over time. And when they come to North America, they almost certainly came with fishermen. Somebody was eating an apple who was probably drying cod potentially on the beach down here in 1518. Throws an apple over his shoulder, thing grows, or they said, well, we're going to come back. Let's plant some seeds and see if we can get some apples. So that's likely how they're introduced in North America. So the end game where we come to North America is the end of thousands of years of human activity. So I'm going to just explain this because this is really fascinating to sort of grapple with. Apples, as we eat them, are a product of humans moving apples, species, different apple species, what we would call crab apples, from areas over to the east here in Central Asia. The green map is the map of an apple called Malus orientalis. You see number 2 on the list. And the third is Malus sylvestris, which comes from Western Europe. And they have to come together, cross-pollinate, to make the apples that we eat today. And it's just, it's amazing. It takes 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years for those apples to come together, and then voila, we have our modern apple. You'll forgive me, I'm writing a book on this, so I have a lot of things that I'm like, ooh, this is really interesting. Everybody needs to know this. There are native crab apples, wild species of crab apples, small apples in North America, but they're much further west, like New York State. So we don't have any here in Maine. And what's interesting about this hybrid is there's a botanical principle called hybrid vigor, which means that hybrids tend to be very vigorous growing. You see this often with pears. Pear seedlings will grow really big. And so these apples come from a diverse set of geographical backgrounds. They come together and they're incredibly adaptable. They can grow Malus sylvestris, the Western European apple, grows from central Spain all the way up into northern Germany, into areas in the north. Malus orientalis all through parts of the Middle East, Iran, mountains, and then Malus sylvestris, which is in Kazakhstan, is at 6, 7, 8,000 feet in the mountains. So that when Europeans bring apples to North America, they're like, okay, we know what to do here. We're ready. We can go anywhere. So apples are distributed in North America very quickly after Europeans bring them here, from Alabama to Quebec, parts of Central America and the highlands of Central America, South America, all the way up into like Alberta, Minnesota, the desert Southwest, California, all over. Because the apples have all the sort of adaptive capacity of the 3 progenitor species. So it's really remarkable. There is an apple from Mobile, Alabama on the Gulf Coast. And I don't think we think of apples being that adaptable, but what they did, the apples, the ones that survived had some genetics that made them survive, in this amazing diversity of North America. So essentially, they'll take root from like Quebec, Ontario, down all the way into southern Chile and Argentina, basically almost all of this hemisphere, except for the lower elevation tropical regions. Okay, so who and where? How did apples arrive in America? As I said, this area is one of the prime candidates for where, because there are more Europeans come to this area seasonally between about 1500 and the initial sort of settlements in places like Massachusetts or Jamestown or New Amsterdam, Quebec. And they were along this coast from roughly Labrador to Cape Cod in large numbers. Every year, say 1520, 1540, there are 600 to 700 boats coming across the Atlantic to fish the cod banks offshore here, basically from George's Bank all the way up to Newfoundland. And one thing they're doing is they're catching fish. The other thing they're not doing is keeping very many records. So we really don't know where they were. We know they were coming to what they called Terra Nova. You can see this Descriptio Terra Nova. This map is from 1529, and it's showing you Newfoundland, and then the coast going down towards us is on the north. Oh, I should keep doing this. Right? So what's fascinating about this is I said they didn't leave any documentation. But the DNA is a kind of documentation because it's inside the apples. It's actually inside the leaves of the apples is where we extract it from. So the evidence is showing us some information that's very, very curious. And actually, I've spent the last year trying to think about how this could be possible. So far, and this is really important, so far, there are a small handful of French apples, this one on the right being one of them, called Rainette Franche, that are in the background of almost every early American apple, including some of the ones that are out here. And that is not what you would expect, right? You would not expect necessarily French apples to be in the background. You would think perhaps English apples would be in the background. We have not yet found a single English ancestor of any early American apple in Maine. And this, well, how could this be true? Has sort of obsessed me for the last year and a half since we sort of started to put these pieces together. So therefore, one of the questions is, well, if French apples are in the background, then probably French fishermen or French settlers, potentially Dutch settlers who shared apples in the continental apples. The question was like, okay, so where is this happening? How could it be happening? So the fundamental fact of why we're looking for these early DNA is on offshore islands is because they're genetically isolated. On the mainland, you have lots and lots of apples being planted, and the genetic signal could be swamped by more modern apples. So the kind of hope beyond hope, it's like it's chasing really a chimera. It's like trying to find this little tiny thread of evidence. But the only place I think we're likely to be able to find the genetic evidence is on these offshore islands. This is a 1604 map by Champlain. So just a quick history review, because not everybody knows this history, and it's very relevant to the question that I'm talking about today. So Giovanni Caboto, the people the English call John Cabot, sails along this coast in 1497. Then Verenzano comes through in 1524, coming around Cape Cod. He reports finding apples. So apples are introduced to North America likely between 1497 and 1520, because he sees a tree that's big enough to see. Then the 1608, first permanent French settlement in Nova Scotia, John Smith and the European settlement here on the island briefly, and then first permanent durable settlement, it really doesn't take place until after the end of the 7 Years' War, what in British North America is called the French and Indian War. So, so what's interesting about this is apples are present from 1524, and then with permanent settlement around 16 something. They're probably introduced on the land inland side, and then on the outer islands a little bit later. And again, the reason I emphasize this, it means that if there are apples out here until roughly the French and Indian War, 1760, these are genetically isolated populations out here. Okay, so up and down the coast, we find these huge old trees. And some of them are pointing, some of them are children of these French apples. So that means that French apples were likely present on the coast of Maine. But not on Monhegan yet. What we've learned so far, that only one apple has ancestry that may indicate this really early heritage. And so one of the apples, which is one up on the hill that I call colorfully red octopus, may have some really old genetics in it. We have to do some further discernment of the data. We've also learned that there's one apple that I think only exists on Monhegan and was grafted by somebody onto several trees. It exists basically from the other side of town on the shore, right by the ice pond, and then over here at Monhegan House. Those three are identical, so somebody grafted them, and I don't know which is the mother tree, whether it's the one by the ice pond, right down as you go down along the side of the ice pond, or the one that's over at the other ice pond. So actually, the fresh pond, the meadow, is that what you call it? So the meadow, there's one there, and then one at the other side. And the other thing we learned is from the background, from the history, the genetic history of the apples, is almost all of the apples that are here that we were able to detect the parentage of are apples that are products of typical 19th century apples that would have been widely grown. And the other thing that I'll tell you is this Monhegan, what I call Monhegan's own, I just made up the name, Monhegan's own, this apple that is from here exists nowhere else so far. We've not found it anywhere else. So it's very likely an apple from here. Okay, so here are the Monhegan apples. So as you go up to Lobster Trail, there's a tree just as you get to the head of the trail on your left-hand side that is unique. Okay, so this apple, there are two possible explanations of this. It's an amazing apple. I have it over here. It's really dense fleshed, high acid, high sugar, really great eating apple. And it's unique, which means it's either a seedling tree that grew up, or it's one of the lost varieties that we have not ever seen before. So unique apples are really good, and this is one that I'm going to try to do some more research on that site to try to figure out what's going on. And that's, as you go up to Lobster Trail, you'll see this sign that says Akabush Awaka, and the tree is right in behind it, so you can see that tree. It's a single trunk, it comes up, it looks like it was probably cultivated, so it's very likely part of an old landscape. And again, I want to emphasize, this tree exists nowhere else in America. So this is likely either a unique tree from here or one of our lost varieties that we're looking for. Red octopus. That's a tree. That's one tree, we think, that has something like 25 trunks to it. And I call it red octopus because it grows like an octopus. It goes along the ground and suckers up and then grows another trunk and grows another trunk. We're still trying to figure out, because I'd have to test every stem to see if it's all one tree, but it's a very, very unusual tree. The only trees that I've ever seen that grow like this are unbelievably rare wild species apples from places like Bhutan. So I don't know what's going on there. This one was unique as well. And what's interesting about this one is red fleshed. It's got this beautiful pink. Many of you probably have eaten this apple and are like, ooh, cool, this is beautiful. And it's a gorgeous little apple, amazing. Again, high acid, dense, high sugars. And what's interesting about this is you all have a lot of really high quality fruit, whether they're seedlings or not, I'm not sure. But if this is a seedling, it's amazing. I'm actually going to see if I can enter this in a national seedling exhibition next year, because I think with the name Red Octopus, it'll win. So Monhegan House number 1. So as you're over here, looking to the left of the house, there's one big, really big tree, wide spreading tree. It's number 1. And this is unique, and I'm certain this is a lost variety. Or a local variety from Monhegan that only exists on Monhegan. And the hope is, as we test these, that they'll match to other things and we'll begin to be able to put the pieces together. But for now, this is really cool. I mean, literally right there, there's a tree that exists nowhere else in the world. And the fruit is amazing. So another one that Kathy took me to very early, I call colorfully back path russet. So I know where it's from. It's on the back side of the meadow, and it's a russeted apple. And it is the child, it has in its parentage an old Russian apple that's brought to the United States in 1870 called red astrakhan, and then another one called golden russet number 2. One of the things that we've found in the research is russets are very hard to distinguish because a lot of them look very similar. So people began to call everything a golden russet. But what we've found through the genetics is there's a golden russet 1, there's a golden russet 2, there's a golden russet 3, and now we're trying to attach historic names to them by a process of phenotypic, by looking at them very carefully with historic descriptions. Both of these, so red astrakhan is a Russian apple. They bring it into the United States in 1878 so that it's very, very winter hardy. It's an August apple, really good, dense flesh, summer apple, which people here valued very highly because it was often the first fruit they would get. First week of August, second week of August, they would get fresh, delicious, apple-y fruit. So this means that red astrakhan was on this island, and it means that golden russet was on this island, and a bee one day went from one of them to the other and created the back path russet. And Kathy, you get to make up the name for it, whatever. It's a terrible name. But I have to keep track of where things come from. And then this is Monhegan's own. This is the one that comes from on the other side of the island over by the ice pond, the one that's right down by the meadow. And then this is the Monhegan number 2, which is the one that's laden with fruit today, just right out here, Monhegan House. So again, this is an apple that somebody noticed, and they took a piece of it and they put it, I don't know which of the 2 trees, the one over by the ice pond or the one in the meadow, is the oldest. I'd have to take a core from them to see if I could get a date. One of those is likely the mother tree, and then somebody grafted it onto the tree here at Monhegan House. My hypothesis is this one from over by the ice pond, when I went there, was a tree about this big, which had fallen over and died, and the rootstock had come up. So that indicates likely that that could be the mother tree. But the one that's down by the meadow is also really, really old. So these are quite old trees. And then the Monhegan house number 2 is younger. So the pond side one is down right there by the meadow, and then this is the one right in by Monhegan house. By the way, these are amazing. So you should eat them. You should definitely eat them. And this one is interesting because it's a combination of two mid 19th century apples, 1850-ish. One called Haas, the one on the right is a red apple, and the other one is called Primate. Again, this means that both of these apples were being grown on the island, and a local bee took pollen back and forth and created for you the one that I'm provisionally calling Monhegan's Own. And you have a lot of this sort of, it's very interesting, the apples here, many of them are sort of this red type with russeting around this cavity, around the stem. And I believe it's the combination of the influence of Haas and red astrakan in the background of a lot of these apples. And there are many, many more. I mean, you all should imagine what I do with my day all day. Many of you saw me walking around today maybe with my apple picker. Oh, cool, look at this tree, look at that tree. Let's see what this one is. Let's see what that one is. But there are dozens and dozens of old grafted trees and excellent quality seedling trees all over the island. And this one actually, this little russeted one is right by, we were talking about the cherries that are right as you come down from the inn down to the gallery, the main road. This one's right on the corner. It has these delicious little russeted apples that I'm going to test this one this year because it's very unusual and it's amazing fruit quality. Yeah. Okay, so I was very disciplined. I could have talked for a long time, but I thought maybe, I've thrown a lot at you. There's a lot of questions you may have. So I thought I'd stop and just say thank you and see what questions you have for me. Yeah?
Is that like because they're a superior apple?
Yeah.
Because they're just a unique apple, or and if they are superior, in what ways are they superior?
Yeah. So the question is they're recording this so that people can listen later. The question was essentially why save the apples? Are they better? What's interesting and important about them? I would say there are two reasons for doing it. One is because it is really, in some ways, the work of people's parents and grandparents and great-grandparents to select and propagate these trees. And each one of the varieties was somebody saying, there's something about this tree that's really important. And sometimes we don't know what's important about it. We haven't noticed yet. We haven't grown it recently, so we don't know. So there's a kind of accumulated wisdom in the selections that people made that we need to still learn about, so that we know before we're like, oh, those aren't any good, right? That we learn again why they were saved. The other one, and this is maybe complementary to that as well, is so we've all been experiencing climate change recently, right? What grows well here now may not grow well here in 50 years. And it may be the heirloom varieties that are growing in other places now, or it could be that there's certain aspects of some of our trees, disease resistance, climate adaptation, et cetera, that they have the genetic background for that can then be bred into new apples that can really help us. One of the things that I say often, and this tree is the tree right across the road from my house, That's the last remaining branch of the tree, so it had lost 3 pieces of itself, like this, 2 pieces of itself. So this is the last remaining piece of itself. And some of those really old trees, even the older ones, the ones that are 11 feet in circumference, those potentially were planted at the end of the Little Ice Age. So they lived through a climate that was roughly 3 degrees colder than it is today, and well, actually probably more now with climate change. So they have been through absolutely everything, climatically. Like if you think about drought, hurricanes, blah, blah, blah. So they have a kind of resilience that could be helpful genetically to breed into modern cultivars. And Kathy was saying this one, the Monhegan 2 apple, bears fruit every year, pretty heavily, and that's a great quality for commercial growers, because most apples tend to produce one year and then not so much the next, and you can control that by pruning and that sort of stuff. So there are characteristics of these cultivars and the diversity of the cultivars that seems to me like the I don't know, apple piggy bank of all time. You know, that people save these for us, and before we throw them away, we should be like, oh, I wonder what's in that piggy bank, right? And I think that the other thing that I would say, just from my own perspective, it would not take much. Well, I mean, many of you have this experience today. You try some of these apples, like, whoa, why can't I get this at the market? Why can't I have this? And so I think the future food system may return to us having a little bit more tasty and delicious things. So. And the other thing I would say, one thing I would say about the apples historically, they were for baking. They were for, and when I say baking, quite literally, they would take the apple, they'd cut out the core, and they would bake it. They were for cooking, so making breads and apple candauti and all these other things. Some were for keeping. Some were for making apple molasses. They would take cider and boil it down into a sweetener. So it was their sugar cane. So you just go down the list. There were an apple for every season, an apple for every use. And yeah, I think those things could be helpful for us in the future again. We'd be happier, I think. Yeah, Kathy.
So apples were our big export item for Maine.
Yeah. Yeah.
In what period is that?
1880 to about 1925, 30, yeah.
I can't believe how many barrels.
Yeah, so what Kathy's referring to is in Britain, after what's called enclosure, they basically take away common lands that had been held by peasants for years and years and years in the 18th century, and basically begin to push people into the cities. So land ownership in the UK is highly concentrated, and agricultural production is in these large estate production units, not small farms. So they had this thought that the colonies would provide food for them, that they didn't need to produce it for themselves. You know, they could have your great estate and do whatever you wanted, because the colonies would provide food for you. And so they began to buy food from Canada, from the United States, from other places. And by about 1890, 2 million barrels a year are being shipped from Maine ports to Liverpool every year. And they're basically going into the industrial centers of England to basically feed people who no longer live on the land. So America, you know, we have a very democratic agricultural society, lots of land and lots of landowners. And one of the interesting things about this, going back to the question, like, why are these worth anything? There used to be, in America, by about 1900, something like 18,000 named varieties of apples. And the reason is because people took apples to Alabama, they took them to North Carolina, they took them to Ohio, Minnesota, Maine, you know, Colorado. I went to visit some friends in Montezuma County in the Four Corners of Colorado. It's desert. They grow lots of apples there. So again, it's fascinating. And everybody in New England was sort of close to the ports, was producing huge numbers of export apples. And in fact, Haas and Red Astrakhan and Golden Russets those were the ones that were going in barrels. And, you know, they would go from here down to Portland and then be in, you know, they'd be in Liverpool in 3.5 to 5 weeks, depending on the season. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah.
I'm wondering, when was grafting invented? You know, when did someone figure out they could stick a branch on another tree? And
Yeah. I laugh because I spent the last month writing about this earliest period of the introduction of fruit trees into the Middle East, we think, first. So grafting is quite interesting because they learn how to graft and how to propagate some plants like grapes and figs and dates relatively early on. But grafting hardwood, woody plants escapes them for a little bit. We think that the evidence is that it probably is something like between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. And it's so ancient that they don't really know whether it happened in the Middle East or in China. So the evidence is very mixed, but then by about 1,000 years BC, so roughly 3,500 years ago, you begin to see some references, for example, in the Talmud, in Jewish sacred texts, to grafting. We don't know if they're talking about grapes or apples or pears or anything like that, but then we know that by about 150 BC, the Greeks are starting to graft fruit trees. And it's really remarkable when you think about that. This is one of the things that I sort of was very, very interested in this, because you can't move an apple, the apple that you want, this apple, without grafting. But people were moving them with seeds for thousands of years before that. And then finally they figure out this grafting technique, and then this apple can move. So it's very interesting. At first it's seeds moving, and then eventually it's cyanwood. And there's actually some evidence. It's very interesting. This was used by the Greeks. They would take a pear, a hard pear, and they'd cut the cyanwoods and they'd stick them in the pear to keep them fresh while they were being shipped. And in the 19th century here in Maine, they would do it with a potato. So in 1860, 70, 80 in Maine, they're doing exactly the same thing that the Greeks did, 2,500 years earlier. They're just using a potato instead of a pear. I guess they had potatoes on hand. But it's brilliant, right? It keeps that end, the cut end, wet, and it lasts. You can keep it forever. Yeah. You had a question up here, and then I'll get back to you.
Well, you mentioned that maybe coming over and a lot of fishermen and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I got thinking, what do fishermen like to do?
Yeah.
Were they making cider?
Yeah. So this.
Fishermen like to drink. I'm sorry.
So
yeah,
well, no apologies.
Were they fermenting?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question. I think almost certainly they're bringing cider. And the Basques in particular, sort of northern Spain, have a very, very old, they have one of the oldest cider traditions in Europe. And they would designed ships that had these huge, great barrels built into the ship. So they are bringing their cider, and they're almost certainly bringing their apples. But again, one of the things that I'm very careful about is I am desperately looking for evidence, of what was it like? Because they were coming here and they were camping out on these islands for 2, 3, 4 months at a time. Some of them, like up further in Labrador, mostly whaling, and as they came down here, mostly cod fishing. So they're drying the fish on flakes but they would come back to the same stations year after year. And I've got to believe that at one of these places, apples got started because people ate the apples and threw them over their shoulders. And they're like, oh, cool, this is really interesting. And one actually really interesting, tantalizing little bit of evidence. So when the Massachusetts Bay Colony shows up, one of the first named varieties of apples is called orange sweeting. And they get it from the local Native Americans. And I was like, what? Where did they get it? Where did that come from, right? So before the English show up, the English tend to think that when they show up, Europeans have showed up. But it's clear that there are these other people who are here, and that apple, I'm almost positive what happened was these native Indians somewhere along the coast saw an apple and was like, oh, let's plant that. And so it becomes one of the first named varieties in America is a Native American apple being given to Europeans. Which is just like, how did that happen? And it turns out, yeah? Yeah. The world's biggest apple? Ooh, well.
Is there recorded a record of?
That's an excellent question. I do not know the answer to that. There is an apple. There's an apple about this big called Wolf River that is commonly grown in Maine, and it's for baking. And the other one is called Cat's Head because it's the size of a cat's head. So, yeah, but they're big. And there's an apple called 20 ounce, which means the fruit weighed almost 2 pounds. And again, people would say you could make a pie and a half with one apple. So, yeah, you had a question back there.
I was wondering about what rootstock, or how do they decide what to graft onto?
So the question was what rootstock? So they would plant seeds from these apples so that they would just take seedling rootstocks. They'd plant seeds out, and then they would put their varieties on top of that. And what's really interesting is they learned very quickly that there were certain seeds, certain lines that were better, that healed better, and that were more able to heal the wound. You'll see some trees that come up where the rootstock is really vigorous. The tree will come up like this, and then it'll actually go in like that, and then up. And that means the rootstock is more vigorous than the graft. But they learned that Tolman Sweet in particular was one apple that that worked with everything, like adapted really well. So they would often select certain kinds of seedling rootstocks for that. They did know about very early on, the Romans knew about this, the Greeks knew about this. They knew about apples that would say quite small, dwarfing, and they called that the paradise rootstock. But for example, I think a lot of the early apples were almost certainly planted from seed. Some were brought over. Again, the earliest evidence of the introduction of grafted trees that I've been able to find yet, 1631, a ship comes from England to Massachusetts Bay with 300 trees. And I believe that those are grafted trees that are being brought in. By 1648, I found a nursery book from Hartford, Connecticut, where the guy's grafting English. He has English trees, he's grafting them, he's selling them. So by 1648, grafted trees are being spread around here in Maine over when Thomas Gorges is settling here in 1640. He brings a tree over in a tub. So I've got to believe that was a grafted, favorite tree of some sort. But the seedling rootstocks, for example, Richmond Island, which is just off of South Portland, was one of these fishing stations. And we have a letter from that early period, the 1630s, where they say, please send us pear and apple seeds and crocuses. And I'm like, crocuses, cool. Maybe for saffron? I don't know what they were hoping, but they were asking for seeds so that they could start to plant an orchard by the 1630s. So, yeah.
Do you think large-scale commercial farming is changing the way apples are exchanged throughout history?
Oh yeah. Yep. So the question was, do I think large-scale apple is changing the ways that apples are exchanged? Yes. Because what's happened is we get apples now almost year-round from around the world. The apples are taken, they're grown on a massive scale, and they're put into what's called controlled atmosphere storage. So they pump the oxygen out and they pump nitrogen in so they don't ripen. So you can harvest the apples and just sit on them, just wait. So the first thing that has happened because of the massive scale of apple growing is you actually only get ripe apples, like actually ripe apples that actually come off of a tree ripe, for about 6 to 8 weeks in the fall, maybe 6 to 8 weeks. I always laugh because, you know, here in Maine, you'll get Macintosh that they're selling to you in August. It's not an August apple. And I don't know if they harvested it last year or they're just harvesting it really early. So one product of the massive sort of commercial production is small producers cannot compete in the market because, for example, in Maine, Hannaford, which is the local market, they're buying like, I don't know how many tens of thousands of pounds for their whole store network, and they want to buy from 1 or 2 people. They don't want 28, you know, they don't want 28 producers. So first off, you know, we're not getting local stuff. We're not getting stuff grown by small-scale farmers that we know. Fruit's never ripe. It's actually not ripe. And secondly, and lastly, the other thing I think that's really happened is, you know, we're getting apples in some cases here that are produced in New Zealand last year and then released onto the market. They just go, psh, you know, let out the nitrogen, let some oxygen in, it starts ripening, and send it to the United States. They'll eat it. But there are different cultures of apples as well. I mean, none of that really happens. For example, Japan has a very, very high value in almost perfect fruit. And boy, would that be great if we had that here, right? That people really valued. For example, some apples that are sort of perfectly taken care of, people, you know, value as like this really high value agricultural product as opposed to a commodity. One of the things that I often say is, you know, when you think about a place like out in Washington State, some of the orchards are 30, 50, 60,000 trees, and they'll grow that variety for 5 or 6 years, and they'll tear out 10 or 20,000 trees, put in the new latest variety. So, and I would say the other thing, and this is true generally of agriculture, is we rarely get truly fresh food in many cases. And I'm not sure that's a great thing. So, well, I'll give you an example. One other, and I don't know about Monhegan, but Bar Harbor. Bar Harbor in about 1910, 1900, had 11 small markets. Okay, so we didn't have a supermarket. We had markets, right? And most people went to the markets like in their neighborhoods. And so they would know, for example, in my case, they said, oh, Todd loves knotheads. Let's make sure that, you know, second week of October, we have some knotheads. Because it was small, it was local, it was face-to-face. And then as supermarkets begin to develop, you know, they aggregate, they buy in larger quantities, so that sort of, you know, disappears from the market. And all of those apples were coming from, very likely, that were being sold, say, in a town like Bar Harbor, were coming from within 25 miles of where they were being consumed. So, other questions? You had a question in the back.
Yeah, I was wondering if you would recommend anything that we could do as a community here to take care of what we have.
Yeah. So the question was, what could we do to take care of what we have here? I would say you could do 3 things. Prune, prune, and prune. A lot of the trees have been abandoned for a long time. So having people learn how to take care of the trees, how to prune them, and then once the trees are sort of taken care of and healthy, you have a lot of fantastic. I would plant a ton of apples on this island because they love it here, and you have some spectacular apples that you know could feed people beyond the island. So, starting to graft, learning to graft the trees that are on the island, and I think that, you know, a Monhegan orchard would be cool. You know, an orchard of, though you have an orchard, like it's here, it's like all around you. So I think maybe mapping what you have already, because a lot of people know the apples. You know, people know the island like the back of their hand. So together you could do a really cool map of the different apples. And one of the things that I've noticed, if you walk around here, They're the August apples, they're the September apples, they're the October apples. You know, sort of season by season, what's the best apple that's ripe today? Because I mean, the thing that's really interesting, I mean, you all may know this, but off the island, there's basically no fruit on apple trees. And I came onto the island, okay, there's some apples here. So you all had something like pollination, something was a little different here. And I think that in general, the sea tends to moderate the environment a little bit so that you have, you know, some better conditions than other places. So. Yeah, well, this is one of the things. So the other thing, obviously, and you know, I was going to talk with Jen about this. I would love to come back and just like sample everything. I'd love to know what's out here. Do some more DNA testing because, you know, when I look at the trees, one of the things that you all probably have seen these pictures of Monhegan in 1900. There's not a stick. There's not a tree. You know, from the wharf up to the top of the hill. From the wharf up to the, it's you know, cleared. And the only trees that are standing are trees that people planted and they were left there to be taken care of and people took care of them. And so I think bringing back that culture of care of the trees and then, you know, as far as I can tell, I mean, a lot of them are potentially grafted trees, but you could start naming them and sharing them. I mean, it's really an amazing, you really need a cider company out here because y'all got some really good apples for making cider. Okay, well that's it. If you have any other questions, you can come up and see the apples up here. I'll cut open one of the red octopus so you can see the pink flesh, and feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you so much.